Everyone, it's way overdue, but they're back, the Brothers Gallo, and we are happy to celebrate 7 years in the compliance arena for the Brothers Gallo. Gents, welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here, man. So happy to be back with you in the middle of
Yeah.
summer after we broke the 7-year barrier.
Very cool. Congratulations.
Yeah.
You guys have
Pumped
meant a
for this
lot to the
time. Thanks for
compliance
having us on.
community. And yeah, I hope we can continue this. So lots has happened since we last got together. And I'm going to start with our good friends at FTX, because this may be the gift that always gives. It certainly has not stopped giving yet. But here we're going to focus on the CEO. And he apparently was as big a part of this as anyone. He got huge compensation for a CEO, sort of red flag number one. Alleged to have paid off whistleblowers, although I suppose you could call that a settlement. And he was a part of the kind of inside group. Where do you go when you've got a CCO who is so embedded with management that he goes along with whatever they propose?
But I think you got to ask who's running the show there, right? So I think with FTX, as with a lot of organizations that seemingly stunk from the head, right? Like the leaders who put the CCO in place were obviously putting all this stuff together. I think that speaks to having some independence or board oversight for the CCO that you put in place, because if the fox is hiring the hen to watch the hen house, it might just be a fox in feather clothing with a bunch of hairs.
I will personally accept that.
But he was transferring assets to himself. There was just so much stuff paying off, like you said, paying off the whistleblowers. He was in the mix with these guys. And yeah, I think I like to think that us as ethics and compliance folks, we're a better breed. We put integrity over these other things, but we're all at least susceptible to the foibles of everybody else, like everybody else is. And I don't know. I'm just thinking about from an investor standpoint, like investors these days, they do cursory diligence before investments, and they're like, okay, they got a compliance officer, and all right, that we're good to go there. I don't know what diligence they could have done on this guy's character to prevent this, but it's definitely a blow to FTX's reputation if there's anything of that left. And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. I just can't imagine that he's not going to avoid jail time.
Let me take the FTX.
Yeah, on that, Tom, let me put it back on you. What is too much to pay a CCO? I think they're all underpaid. I think everyone in compliance should be paid more. Why is that a red flag?
Because when you're getting large one-time bonuses for specific actions, when, as Gio said, assets are being transferred, although that's perhaps even beyond the pale for FTX, when you're paid multiples of what the going rate is and there's no business justification. So I know CEOs who've been paid 7 figures over multiple years, but it was typically in a situation where the company was in a very bad either enforcement action or some other sort of catastrophic state that they needed a top-notch person. They needed to pay that person. They needed to get them in immediately. At least up until this year or last year, mid last year, I don't think FTX was in that situation, although perhaps they were. But let me flip it in a different direction. And so I knew people at Enron, and that's the closest example I have to FTX.
Yep.
And they were clear that they were smarter than everyone else. And they made no bones about it. And if you crossed them, they would remind you that they were smarter than anyone else. They were smarter than anyone else because of the development of energy trading. And that's what they were living off of, which in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, was an innovative development. But of course, they took it several steps further, and then accounting fraud set in, and they continued to have that arrogance. I've done a fair amount of studying on Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX since the last time we got together. And I see a lot of that arrogance, although not as blatant as what I saw in Enron. It's the, oh, shucks, yeah, I just know more than anybody kind of thing. And the way he played it, have you guys seen that? I know you've seen that in your prior business, but have you seen that in 20-somethings to have that kind of irrational confidence or even overconfidence? Or is it really unique to the fact of what he was selling, and obviously billions were invested with him?
Yeah, I've seen that. We hired a guy that was like that once. He didn't end up staying that long, but he was like wildly confident, just wildly confident about just everything that he was doing. And yeah, it was obviously tons of blind spots. He had no justification to be that confident. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So I think it's probably, I don't think it's generational. It might be like personality type based or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think part of what we're talking about is there are red flags there, right? Like that signals a lack of empathy, a lack of self-awareness. To be patently overconfident, you have to either lie to yourself or be lying to everybody else. And that's especially dangerous if you're not only like the CCO who's supposed to be monitoring this stuff, but you're also like setting up major transactions for the company. It sounds like some of the accusations against Friedman are not the CCO or Friedberg are not just that he didn't find and watch stuff, that he was actively like setting up accounts in bad ways. And I think to the earlier question here, it begs the question of, was anybody trying to make sure that this organization was monitored well, or was this just a paper tiger of we're a fintech company, or we can stave off the debate of whether these are commodities, but we're working in finance, so we got to have a CCO. Because to the question of are there red flags or someone being overconfident, someone who's maybe trying to pull the wool over consumers' eyes might love that and say, hey, this guy's blustery and he'll say anything to get someone to think that he's doing a good job. And to Nick's point, I think that there are a bunch of different kind of personality traits and foibles that might lead somebody to express that
But
way.
if you think about the Dunning-Kruger effect, that's like beginner's luck, right? We've all seen this beginner's luck thing. That's a great antidote to confidence, because you think everything's going great and then you're brought back down to earth. And I think in the case of FTX, it's almost like we didn't see the sort of tip of that Dunning-Kruger effect until the collapse. So it's almost like he had this like really elongated time for that confidence, that overconfidence to continue to build. And I mean, he was getting massive investments with, I don't want to say it's very little work, but like guys obviously weren't like taking it for a test drive or really looking that deeply under the hood. So that kind of creates this like I don't know, it's just like this self-reinforcing belief that just allows it to continue to perpetuate. And once that momentum really starts to build, then you got all these like lemmings running off the cliff. It's really an interesting story, because when we were fundraising, for example, or we were looking to whatever, like you fall on your face fast, and it's a very humbling experience. And that I think grounded us to some degree, and it let us stay humble and stay hungry and stuff like that. And had we not had those failures, I think it's very easy to just naturally start to read your own headlines and believe you're better than you are.
Yeah, this stuff must be hard for everyone else, because I am just great at
this
this.
is easy for
like,
me. Yeah, it's easy to raise
which
a couple
is a
$1
great
billion.
signal that you are falling victim to the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know why this is so hard for everyone. This stuff is
It's easy. Yeah.
If you find yourself saying that, you should maybe
Careful.
you're just a natural,
Yeah.
but maybe you should check it.
I don't know. One time at a conference, I was on a podcast conference. Someone asked me, what's hard about podcasting? And I just said, there's nothing hard about podcasting. You try practicing law. So,
yeah, what's hard about podcasting, Tom, is having an answer to your boss.
Exactly. It's even worse. I have 2 executive assistants now, and I answer to them. So,
Isn't that funny how that
Like, let's
changes?
go, Tom.
That's true.
gosh,
That is
even
true.
my wife texts me, have you done your assignments from your EAs yet? No, but I'm getting ready to do it. Right on it.
Shout out to Jaja. What's up?
Yeah, and so actually we have number 2. We have Ivy now to supplement Jaja.
Hey, Ivy. Welcome to the crew.
Yeah. Let's change the focus a little bit. The Supreme Court, at the end of its term, eviscerated affirmative action at universities. And the case was directly in the education field, was not a business. But now the question has come up of how will this play out in corporate America? I would note for you both, though, that the court's ruling specifically carved out its application to the U.S. Army or the U.S. military, because the U.S. military said we have to reflect the population of the United States, so we have to have a diverse military. Seems like to me that's exactly what corporate America says. We have a diverse population and we need to reflect that. But how have you guys thought about this? Is this something that we collectively need to think about? I have to say, greatly worries me. But what are your thoughts as guys running a much bigger than a 3-person business?
For us, if you ever look at our ads, we really try to open our our ads up for folks who are maybe underrepresented minorities or for women. And we put things in our job posts that say, if you think that you might even be able to do this job, you should apply for it. Because I think a lot of times underrepresented minorities and women in particular, they end up getting into this sort of trap where they don't get opportunities, or they don't get opportunities that can lead to those other opportunities. And it creates this like barrier for them to even apply to things that they think that they can do. I'll tell you, I've never taken a job at any point that I could do the whole job. I just always thought that I could do it. And so we try to open that up for folks. We don't try to solve for necessarily, we want to have a diverse place. We want to have a place that presents opportunities for people of all races and walks of life and all that kind of stuff. And so we try to solve that on the front end by opening it up to more people. At the same time, we don't have 100,000 person organization. So it's critical as we're at this fast growth stage that like we hire whoever we think the best person is. It helps that we have a ton of leadership that are women, minorities, stuff like that. So that kind of is a self sort of correcting mechanism, I think, built into our system. So we might be in a little bit of a unique situation. I'm not really clear on how this ruling is going to be interpreted or perhaps misinterpreted in like the broader business world.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about, is it still important? Is it relevant? Should this change for corporate America? I think diversity is important. And there are plenty of studies that show that diverse teams come up with better ideas, or more innovative, or more productive, and things like that. I tend to think that looking at this is a case specifically about affirmative action in universities, and in some ways that started to bleed over into legacy, or considering whether you're going to admit people if their parents went to the school. I think that's a specific forum with a specific intention around what interest does the government have in regulating how people get into higher education institutions. I think in the corporate world, there's a balance, and I tend to be a bit of a federalist, and that people should figure this out short of violating commonly accepted morals and laws. And I think different companies are going to shake out differently on this. I think that there's a great case to be made, and we ascribe to it, that hiring diverse people, having a diverse team is good. And also, I think there's a lot of credence to saying that, hey, there are a bunch of chances that if you create a welcoming environment, a workplace that has situational justice and psychological safety, and is a place where people of diverse backgrounds can shine, you can attract great talent that are overlooked by somebody who's not doing that. I think in a lot of ways, like the case from a corporate standpoint for diversity or diversity programs or inclusion should not have to be like regulated by the government. I tend to think that maybe different from higher education institutions, companies should, within some range of reason, be able to figure that out on their own. I don't expect that this case would be successfully applied to, okay, now all companies can never make any decisions about encouraging applicants from a certain background. It seems like the right answer to that question is much more diverse across companies and the situations that they're in than the application of this concept to higher education. But I do think that companies should be thinking about this. And I think it would be not only against the interests of like society or underrepresented minorities, but also against the interests of their shareholders and performance of the company to their mission, for a company to say, okay, great, the Supreme Court said that colleges can't do this, so we're not going to pay attention to this anymore. I think we feel in some ways that it's the right thing to do. And we feel in other ways that it's the right thing for the business. I think companies should stay the course, but I'm a bit of an idealist, and I'd like to think that companies will do the right thing even without being forced by the government. But then we got the FTXs of the world. We'll see where that shakes out.
Let me pick up on something you said, Nick. It's tangential to this. And it was along the lines of the following. You wanted to make sure in your job postings that they were not so narrow that people would think I never would have a chance, or I don't qualify for that I would go ahead and apply. And even if I don't meet the criteria, I'm not the top candidate, at least I put my hat in the ring. I may learn from that. It may put me in a position later to be successful. In the context of the following, with a group of friends, and one of the guys said what he does is he helps underprivileged or other folks who are having difficulty getting jobs on one-on-one by putting them in touch with people in their industry and they identify a job or jobs they could apply for. And when I say put in touch, I mean they go to lunch together and they talk, and so that creates a resource for the job candidate. And someone in the group said, "Did she get the job?" And he said, "No, she didn't get the job she wanted, but guess what? She's prepared for it now. She interviewed for it. She's got two fabulous contacts that she can call upon as part of her greater network, and she now has the confidence to apply again or apply for another job."
Awesome.
And I
Yeah.
heard you say that from in your opening remarks. And it just struck me. I'd not really thought through that part of the hiring process. I'd always thought about the company's part. But as the candidate, you need to take steps to position yourself. Even if you can't get that dream job right out of the box, you could work towards it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I love what your friend did. And just having lunch with that person doesn't mean it's a foregone conclusion that they're going to get that job. But now, to your point, they've had a conversation about it. They have a better glimpse into what that job looks like, talking to somebody in that industry that can maybe give them some of those insights. And I think all those things start to stack up and can build some momentum for someone to get a job. But yeah, we interviewed someone recently and I just felt so bad for this guy because like he had been interviewing for a really long time and he had some like really bad blind spots and he just came across some ways that I don't think he really was. Like I could see through it, but when folks don't get any like mentorship or they don't get any insight or coaching on those kinds of things, you can really be caught in a real whirlpool for a long time, really be spinning your wheels. And like, how disheartening is that? And how easy is that feedback or how easy is it for that feedback to feed into some broader sort of negative self-talk narrative that, man, I just can't get into this industry or I just can't break through. It's obviously it's a multivariate equation. There's a ton of different variables involved, but good on your friend for doing something to actually make that a little bit better for that person. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we need to do around these things, obviously there are a bunch of ways to impact the situation, but a lot of mentoring programs and corporate diversity initiatives are at least in part centered around breaking down some of these mindsets that keep people from engaging. This is like a two-sided problem, right? Some of it is this company would never recruit somebody with this background, and some of it is people fall into a trap of saying, oh, the deck is stacked against me, or I could never do that job. I only meet 3 of the 5 criteria, so I'm not even going to apply. And I think there are some things that we can do as leaders, as recruiters, as managers, or just as friends or people who want to have an impact to work on the kind of supply side of this challenge of helping break down those barriers and say, hey, you know what, now you know some people, now you realize that this can be possible. And we even coach people internally because we try to cross promote and hire internally as much as possible and let people know that if you apply for something and don't get it, like that's the norm. And a lot of
Right.
people early in their career who don't have a lot of experience get demoralized by that. They're like, oh, I went for that cross department promotion, I didn't get it. And so if we interview 10 people for one job, like 9 out of 10 of those don't get the job.
Right.
So the normal thing is you're going to apply for a bunch of jobs and not get them every time. That doesn't mean that you're not qualified or you could never do this. But so much of this is progress is perfection and helping people realize that, hey, applying for that job is a step, meeting some people is a step, can help transform that. And I think there's a lot that we can do as a company, as leaders, as people that have a say in recruiting to help break down some of those restrictions and open up more opportunities for people who are really well deserving
Yeah,
of it.
but
Because most people are really just looking for a hand up if they need it, not a handout. And I think people get that wrong about diversity initiatives a lot.
yeah, and just I think it's on companies to help break down those kind of structural barriers. And you have to know that people have those things in place. What we say in our ads is that research shows women and people of color disproportionately don't apply for jobs where they don't meet 100% of the quote unquote requirements. So if you think you can do the job, we encourage you to apply. And then we just talk about how we're committed to breaking these structural barriers and driving fair hiring practices. So I think if organizations can do that and we can start to really drive some change. But to sum it up, I think diversity is great for a business. It's great for like your own viewpoints. And I think while affirmative action was meant to try to ensure that the fairness and the equity was like in place. And so whether it's in place or not, I think the onus is always on us as individuals to be as fair and equitable as possible.
Let me turn the focus just a little bit different for a moment and ask you guys, do you have a sense of at what level inside a corporation you should start doing due diligence not just a cursory background check, but real due diligence on corporate executives? Should it be when they move from the enlisted man to officer class? Should it be when they're promoted from colonel to general? Is that too late? Because I've now seen several instances where, clearly the signs were there that there were red flags that should have been addressed, or behavior from prior employers that if someone had looked closely, you would have at least been aware of what you were getting into. Do you guys have any sense of that? Is that something you're asked about at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the internal promotion is an especially interesting dynamic because they've worked here for 5 years and now they have access to a much greater set of impact or opportunities for malfeasance or whatever. I think that that might be a blind spot, but also in some ways you have that context and you've seen them at work. I think it's a question of degree. I know that there's a range of background checks that you can do even just from a background check company, right? That can dig deeper and go more in the past and do deeper references and things like that. But I also think it's the things that are obvious and easy are already getting done, right? Are you a felon? Do you have a rap sheet? Maybe confirm your education and prior jobs and stuff like that. I think a lot of times this is what makes a great compliance and ethics, not only program, but culture so important, is you're probably not going to find a hard record of this person doing something shady 5 years ago. If it's not in the legal record, you're probably not going to get it on a reference call of someone saying, hey, I know I could get in trouble for this, but let me tell you what this guy's really about. I think that diligence should scale up as you're hiring more senior people with more purview. But I think in some ways, you're not going to be able to find that out before you buy or before they're in the case. And you need to make sure that a culture of compliance and oversight really is your backstop for that.
Then let me change the subject even a little bit more, because I get asked this question quite a lot. At what point in a company's life cycle should they put in internal controls? And they're usually asking me compliance internal controls. And my response is compliance internal controls are financial internal controls. And the faster you put financial controls in place, the better your company will be, the better run it will be, the more attractive it will be for investors. If you ever make the decision, obviously, to go public, you won't have to ram a set of controls in place after been doing business for so long. You guys have been in the business of looking at companies for a long time. And do you have a sense of at what point a company should put controls in place, or is it just really not up to each company, but unique to each company?
It might be unique to each company, but I think like the sooner the better. That might sound like a platitude, but whenever we were ever looking at a company, the first thing we would ask, maybe not the first, but very quickly, we'd want to see the audit, the actual audit, and the full audit papers and stuff to see what are the auditors looking at and what kind of, and one thing we'd be looking for is obviously, are the financial statements fairly presented, but also what internal control deficiencies, what financial control deficiencies are in place, because that not only gives you an indication of what financial risk is there, but it also gives you an indication of like, how does the organization think about risk? And so companies that deprioritize that, maybe it's because they're small, maybe because they're scrappy and just getting moving. If they don't have an audit, we would be asking some of those kind of canary in the coal mine type questions to say, again, trying to get a sense of what that risk, how clear is that leadership's risk lens? And because it's all one thing. You're not going to have a company that has like super tight financial controls and then no other controls in place, kind of to your point. Those things tend to move together.
Yeah, I think to the extent that we're saying, when should you start? I would say that start as soon as possible and lower your expectation for what a real compliance program is, because you need to get on a journey.
Yeah.
And what we found in our business when we started getting SOC 2 certified, we're much better in year 5 than we were in year 1. And if we do that a little bit early, then we're going to be better by the time we're like at that bigger stage. And it's the same thing with risk management and compliance and a culture of ethics, is you need to make sure that you're putting some effort into it. And that might mean, hey, you know what? We're not gonna get a full-blown certification. We're just gonna make sure that we have a list of our controls, or we're gonna start here. We're gonna get to what Nick was talking about. We're gonna make sure our financial statements and accounting books are audited. But I think as a leader in any capacity, you need to have this kind of risk management and culture lens and make sure that you're doing something about that. And it's a lot easier to answer, hey, how much should we step up our effort here over the next year, than it is to say, okay, can I get by another
Right.
year without doing anything? I think you got to get on the journey. And also, I think that the ROI for compliance spend is massively high. If you're looking for a place in your organization where you can put a little bit money into an investment and really improve your organization, I think pretty much every organization can get great ROI out of their compliance spend. So you got to get started on it, and you're not going to know how to invest the next 1% of your expenses until you're on that journey. So you got to get started somewhere.
And what you said is pretty important. I think the ROI curve for like investment, it's like changes over time or as like investment increases. And so I think the reason that compliance is such a great place to generate high ROI is because I think in general, it's like relatively across the economy, it's relatively underinvested in at large. And so if you've ever seen one of these shows or like The Biggest Loser, remember, those people who are like overweight go on there and then they exercise and they have these massive gains, right? Like little changes that they've made to their lifestyle and walking and doing a little exercise. They drop a ton of weight so fast. And I think to Gio's point, just getting on that journey and getting started, especially if you're in an organization or in an industry where compliance has been underinvested in, those massive ROI gains are going to be right there for you. But you have to do something to get them.
So let's turn to ESG. And the conversation is continually changing around ESG. But the question I wanted to put on the table is it a business positive or a business negative right now? And what, in addition to whatever internal conversations you guys are having, what are the conversations you're having with clients, customers, people like me in the industry?
So I guess,
And Gio, you're smiling way too much, so you got to start.
All right. I think it's a loaded question. No offense, Tom. It's a question of the current application or maturity of it or the way it should be done. I think that there are a lot of things about the way that, and nothing standardized and stuff like that, that we rate ESG impact that is getting people to focus on things that are not really moving the needle. So I think in a lot of ways, like ESG hasn't matured and it's not being applied in the way that, across the economy or within an industry or within a company. I think there are a lot of ways that like, it's all like the low hanging fruit. Like the ESG all-stars are like software companies and like green energy companies. But that's not where we need ESG improvement, even on just the environmental place. Like to Nick's point about like that curve of return, and happens in a bunch of different things. The place where ESG is going to have the most benefit to a company or society is the company that is furthest from it, because they get on it and they start doing a little bit, and they currently have a massive negative impact on social issues, on environmental, on governance, and they can upgrade it as these things happen, like the Laffer adoption curve. The people who have adopted ESG so far are the people who are like, yeah, I've been waiting for this for years. I'd love to get some more credit for how well we're representing it. And those are the companies that are not going to transform their business model because they adopt ESG or start reporting on it. But I think we got to stay the course because this thing isn't done yet. And as we get past like those early adopters and into kind of the middle of the bell curve of companies that can be benefited by this, that's where we're going to see it transform things. Like I'm familiar with the question and the debate and, this is maybe just going the way of CSR and stuff like that. I think if we stay the course, this is going to be a massive transformation of not just like impact on society at large, but on companies running with a longer term mindset about the full impact to their stakeholders. And I just think we're not there yet.
a paper just came out. Maybe you've seen this. If you haven't, you definitely should check it out, by Kelly Shue, and it's called Counterproductive Sustainable Investing: The Impact Elasticity of Brown and Green Firms. And it just came out. She's a professor at Yale, and she wrote it with this other guy named Samuel Hartmarks. Anyways, the paper kind of argues that exactly what Gio is talking about, that the impact elasticity as defined by the change in impact divided by the change in cost of capital, which they calculate a bunch of different ways and prove out really well. The impact elasticity of green firms or of brown firms is like wildly negative. It's a high negative number, meaning that this crowding out effect that happens as dollars are directed toward more green companies whose impact is relatively small due to those changes in cost of capital. The impact of improvements at a like already green company is relatively small on a kind of a net basis across the economy. That ends up creating a higher cost of capital for those brown firms, which ends up leading to those brown firms deviating from those relatively short-term, more expensive like green investments to becoming more brown. So in those brown firms, that 1% change is many times orders of magnitude bigger on a net basis than a 1% change at a green firm. So is it good? I don't know. I think this crowding out effect does lead to at least the incentive for greenwashing, which is the thing that everybody is talking about right now. And the paper effectively is arguing that the ESG, to the extent that ESG investment is meant to drive a better environmental impact, the way that those dollars are being directed and where those dollars are winding up are actually having a much lower positive benefit on the environment than they would should they have been directed toward these relatively more brown firms, as Gio said. It's a phenomenal paper.
Much smarter way to say that than whatever I said.
So I guess what I see ESG is not from the investing angle, but as a business process. And it has brought rigor around some areas that may have had rigor, but that didn't have rigor with visibility at the highest levels of a corporation. So my sense has always been that the environmental folks were measuring environmental issues, HR folks are measuring diversity and other issues, sustainability folks the same, compliance folks, et cetera. But with ESG, we have one person or one group with visibility across these different corporate disciplines. And my thought was that it allowed for a more efficient and better allocation of resources to those areas where a company would get the most bang for the impact. And maybe that's what you're saying around this crowding out effect. But I had really thought ESG gave us the opportunity to start measuring these different business processes in ways we had not done so before, so that I saw this as greater business efficiency through more process management.
Yeah, and I think I don't think that's necessarily the wrong way to view it. I view it that way, at least ideally. It's what you just described. We can improve our business processes. We can direct investments within the sort of closed system that is our company toward those things that are really going to move the needle most for us. But again, there's just this perhaps countervailing, at least counterbalancing incentive in place to like greenwash through it. And it's easy for this ESG process to turn into a marketing activity to attract ESG minded investors. This is getting a little bit, we can kind of talk about this from a bunch of different angles. If all these businesses were being run with a long-term focus, with leadership that was committed to the long-term impact of ESG initiatives, then I think the odds of what you described, Tom, actually like blooming and taking hold is a lot higher. We have a bunch of perverse incentives in place, not only from the relatively like shorter tenure that most leadership stays in companies, coupled with this, for lack of a better term, the incentive to greenwash to get what essentially translates into a lower cost of capital. Those are in conflict with each other. And so whichever one wins out, I think it'll be interesting to see which one wins out. I think we're already starting to see which one is winning out based on the reactions we're having in the marketplace around ESG, because it's in the eye of the beholder, right? There's so much noise around this. There's so much noise around it. And you have these ESG statements that come out and there's 80 pages and there's 50 initiatives. And are you guys really going to do all of these things? And if you do these things, is it really going to move the needle on a true impact basis? Versus someone like Allison Taylor, who would say, if you want to do ESG right, you need to focus on just a few items and just really do those things. I agree with that. I think you have to take a Pareto approach to it. And over time, if your commitment is really to be more environmentally conscious and drive more social change and all those kinds of things, then those outcomes are going to take care of themselves because all you can control are those inputs. But if you're really trying to control that output, then those perverse incentives, you're opening the window for those perverse incentives to really fly in and start to dictate the way that things go.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to see is, I don't know who makes these decisions. It's some mix of academic institutions and companies making frameworks and companies adopting frameworks and stuff like that. But to the extent that people are being rewarded for some engagement in ESG, I'd like to see it more focused on the transformation than the baseline. Because if you're a solar panel company, then you're going to score really high on your carbon footprint and impact on the environment, probably. And an ESG program is probably not going to transform that much. But if you're like, I don't know, a rubber recycling or a rubber disposal company, then there's probably a bunch of transformation you can drive by focusing on this. And I think the current state of ESG is probably oversampling, saying, hey, look at these green companies or look at these companies that are already performing well on this. That's a portion of it. But if ESG is meant to transform, to your point, Tom, implement processes that transform business for the greater good, then we need to find ways to have an outsized reward for that transformation, right? If like someone scoring a 60 and then they get to a 67, that's a much bigger impact on society than someone who's already at a 99% satisfied all ESG things getting to a 99.5. They're already scoring really high and there's not a lot of room for improvement, and that's a consideration. But I think that ESG as a way to transform the way we do business is what's most exciting, not just a way to rate and point out people who are already doing things well.
But the ESG like the company's reaction is driven by like what they're rewarded for. Like they're rewarded for percent changes in emissions, not like actual like total changes in emissions. You know what I'm saying? Like a really brown company that has a ton of emissions, and maybe they can only reduce that by 1%, but that 1% is 10 times more than what Google reducing it by 10% is. Google gets rewarded for that, or whatever an ESG darling gets rewarded for. The incentives in like organizations are responding to the incentives that the market is putting on them. But the incentives that are in place are generating this behavior. So it's not just like evil companies trying to greenwash their way through it. Like they're playing the game of as determined by the incentives that are in place.
Yeah, they're taking the test that's written for them. They're not making it up. But yeah, to your point, Nick, I think part of what you're saying is like someone having a gross nominal reduction in negative impact, even if it's a small percentage, should get rewarded for that.
I'd like to end on 3 different either enforcement actions or news stories and see if we can draw some lessons out from them. The first one was a $180 million fine against Bank of America, which I think is headquartered where you guys are. I am a Bank of America aficionado, so I have to acknowledge that. But they got caught in 3 areas, but the one I want to focus on was fraudulent accounts. They had an incentive program that incentivized employees to open new accounts of new and existing customers. If that sounds somewhat familiar, that's exactly what Wells Fargo did.
Also in Charlotte. Fargo, also big presence in Charlotte.
Some in the water out here.
Also. Yeah. And Matt Kelly wrote about it, and we were both just aghast. Yeah. But the more I thought about it, I thought there's a really good lesson for compliance professionals, which is, and the BOA scandal happened during and then after Wells Fargo. So fraudulent accounts was definitely in the public eye starting in 2016. And if you're in an industry or a vertical and there's an adjacent vertical or even a competitor who gets into trouble, I think it's a good idea to look and see if you're doing it as well. So I was wondering what your thoughts might be on a compliance practitioner really needs to keep up with current events beyond simply just reading either or listening to, I should say, your podcast or my podcast, and keep up with current events.
Yeah. If it's happening, it's happening to your neighbor, it could be happening to you. This B of A thing is wild. 10 years ago, they got another fine, right? For the same thing. So 10 years later, it's a 10x, 10 years, 10x more. But to your point, it at least to your point shows that like even large organizations can be subject to these ethical malfeasance, we'll call it that. And those are glimpses into what is potentially happening in your organization. So keeping your ear to the ground and knowing what else is going on at your competitors, or seeing what kind of things other folks in your industry might be getting involved or getting in trouble for, is at least a hint on something that you might want to consider looking into within your own organizations, if for nothing else, for your own peace of mind, to know that it's not happening there. Because what a tragedy, right? The same thing was happening right up the street at Wells Fargo, and then a few years later, it's happening over here at Bank of America. It's wild.
Yeah, and so it seems obvious that you should do that, right? If you're driving down the highway and you see someone get pulled over, you should probably pay attention to your speedometer because, hey, you know what? You might they're pulling people. It's the end of the month, or this strip of highway is heavily patrolled, or whatever it is. You should pay attention to those signals. And increasingly, the modern compliance officer needs to be great at pattern recognition and signal monitoring,
Right.
because the job's too complex to just say, hey, we're just going to implement this program and it's probably fine. But also, once you see that, that is like the easiest thing to go to, I think, to go to the executive suite with and say, hey guys, here's, maybe you don't want to print it off, so you wave your tablet around and say, hey, here's an article about these guys across the street that got in trouble. We really need to really make sure that we don't do this. That's probably a very visceral way to do storytelling and say, hey, just spend 90 seconds on this. Imagine what this would be like if not only the regulators now have their eye on this, they're going to be looking out for this, but we're going to be like doubly guilty
Right.
for not having fixed this thing when obviously like it has happened. That's a great way to advocate for your program and say, especially if you've had some resistance, or if you're one of those few chief compliance officers that feels like you could use some more budget to get the job done. That's a joke, we all do. Then that's a great way to advocate and say, hey, here's a story of these guys getting roasted in the media, reputation, stock price, fines, whatever things get your executive team to wake up and care about. That's a great way to tell that story, because I can't imagine that the B of A CCO hadn't heard about Wells Fargo. But I don't want to assume that someone was intentionally hiding this and everyone knew about it or something, but it may just be a roadblock. And hey, you know what? You need to leverage this, and you don't need to celebrate your competitors' missteps, but you should say, hey, you know what? Let's make sure that we don't fall into the same trap. And that's a great way to advocate for it.
The next story comes to us from KPMG, which reported from the Dutch news outlet that KPMG Netherlands has had a major scandal around cheating on the Netherlands accounting exam. 500 employees at KPMG were alleged to have been involved, and that comes to us from KPMG itself. The managing director of the firm has resigned. The head of the board of supervisors has resigned as well. The thing that struck me about this, guys, was KPMG got into a massive scandal in the United States and was fined $50 million by the PCAOB for exactly this. I think they also got into trouble for cheating on exams in the United Kingdom and perhaps Australia as well. But this is just a huge black eye. And the thing about accountants, really all they have to give you is trust and integrity.
Yeah.
You have to trust that the numbers they give you are correct. And I don't understand why KPMG doesn't seem to understand this and crack down and make sure that their people are not cheating on exams.
So I came out of KPMG. That was my first job out of school. That's where I got my CPA. I got it for real. No help. That was straight studying. No cheating involved. I guarantee it. Okay.
But did you use ChatGPT for it?
That wasn't even around in my day. Okay. I was with a calculator and a pencil in my day. I'm so blown away by it. Honestly, I can't really even wrap my head around it. The culture of the team that I was on, it was not anything like this. And to Tom's point, like that's all that profession has. That's the currency, that integrity, that trust. It's a massive black eye. I just still can't even wrap my head around it. I don't understand what the motivation was for it. When I was there, everybody got their CPA. Some people had to take it a couple of times, but the organization was very supportive and would pay for our materials and stuff like that. But everyone got it, and we had a culture of passing the exam. I don't know like what's changed or what's specific to the Netherlands or that group that, that did it in the UK or the US or whatever, but I'm just baffled by it. It's hard for me to wrap my head around the short-sightedness of that kind of a violation for an organization or for a profession that functions solely on this tenet, around this axiom.
Yeah, I think we may have talked with you about this at some point, Tom, in the context of the Wells Fargo scandal that we mentioned, but this seems evidence that this organization did not learn from and respond properly the first time that this happened, right? Proper response would be, hey, you know what? This is not just a problem with this American MD and not just a problem with this UK MD. We might have a deeper culture of ethics issue going on here, and we really need to figure out what's going on. And this, I assume, would have been a much better outcome if they had found it themselves and self-policed and fixed it themselves instead of just waiting to see if another region got caught. It just seems like a cautionary tale for, if you find something like this, that it's not just an isolated incident of a frontline person violating a control, but like a manager in a division that's had this seep into their culture, you got to figure out how to change that. And it's probably not going to just be a mea culpa letter from the lead partner saying, hey guys, we can't do this. You got to probably stay on it, and you got to change the direction of your culture, not just fire someone and say, okay, they saw that guy get fired, so no one's probably going to do it. If anybody thinks that's how cultures are built and human behavior works, you should see a bunch of these examples where one person getting in trouble does not keep other people from doing it. You got to make sure that you build your culture, that you own your impact in the things that are prioritized and incentivized in your organization. And however you got to do that, you got to make sure that gets done. That's a tall order. There's not a single assignment of just do this and it'll be fine. But that's heavy as the head that wears the crown. If you're a leader in an organization, that's your responsibility, and you got to root that out. I hate seeing it happen. To Nick's point, there are a lot of great cultures and great teams at KPMG and across all of these companies. It's tough to see that reputation tarnished like that. If anyone's going through this, then you got to look at this and say, okay, this just might be bigger than this single incident, and we got to do what we can to make sure that it's not going on elsewhere.
But think about this, like over 500 people, at least in this Netherlands one, were part of this thing over a 5-year period. And they didn't find out about it until someone like finally raised their hand and reported it. So there was a lot of like opportunities over that 5-year period for someone to raise their hand and be like, this isn't right. So that's mind boggling as well.
Our final story comes to us about Deutsche Bank, the bank that keeps on giving, at least in the compliance space. And they were under 2 DPAs, one in 2015 and 2017, and the remedy was better internal controls around their money laundering and anti-money laundering program. And now were fined, I believe, 163 million for failure to meet their obligations under their prior 2 DPAs. And now they've got another order where they're supposed to remediate and meet these. How do you get people or an organization to meet their obligations that they've agreed to in an enforcement action?
I don't know. At some point, at some level, I don't know. I'm like, why wouldn't they meet those obligations? There was presumably people within the organization who were spending a lot of time on that DPA and doing a lot of things to try to meet it. Like, how did that ball get dropped? You know what I mean? Like, where did it break down? Was it a tone at the top thing? Was it a, hey, it's only $163 million thing? I don't know. It sounds crazy to say that, but what was Deutsche Bank's like revenue last quarter?
A lot.
2.3 billion. I don't know.
Let me just see. I don't know. When you look at that, Tom, what do you think about it? Because it's just like they've been in this sort of DPA trap. They've been in the DPA cycle, and it just kind of the same thing keeps happening. It's not like that bank is full of idiots. There's tons of smart people in that bank. So what is it? Is it a will thing?
I think it's a failure to come in at the top and communicate that message down to the troops. So
yeah, it might be that.
That would seem like a good point for us to end this episode of the Gallocast. Gents, as always, it's been a ton of fun.
Awesome. Thanks for having us, man. We'll see you guys next month.
Thanks, Todd.
Bye-bye.